Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Purple Way podcast. My name is Paris Tastionas, I'm your host, and today's conversation is with Ben White. Ben, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. No, of course, my pleasure. So, Ben, I was trying to also find out your kind of how to introduce you. So, you're just finishing your PhD in the project that you're doing now, ambient smart environments. But like from neuroscience perspective, do you introduce yourself as a neuroscientist, or how do you introduce yourself?
That's an interesting question. Um, so my background is originally my undergraduate studies were in English literature and philosophy. As I was going through those studies, I became more and more interested in certain kinds of questions in philosophy, questions about aesthetics, ethics, free will, that kind of stuff. But I eventually became semi-frustrated with the methodology of pure philosophy. And so I found myself drawn into cognitive science, from which I ended up being drawn more into theoretical neuroscience.
Mhm.
Um, so, when people ask me now, I basically say I do theoretical cognitive science.
Okay.
I'm not a kind of practicing, um, coal-face neuroscientist. So I don't do any kind of empirical neuroscientific work. I do work with people that do, and obviously a lot of the reading that I do is in that area. But
Mhm.
I would describe myself as working in theoretical cog sci.
Okay. And then how did you come about a predictive processing framework, something that we'll talk about in detail?
Yeah. So I was first introduced to predictive processing when I was at the University of Edinburgh studying
Hmm.
for a cognitive science master's. And at the time, that was back in 2018. And when I started that master's, I'd not heard of predictive processing. I was more kind of throwing myself into studying I'm sure we'll talk about 4E cognition as we get going as well, but basically embodied cognition and distributed cognition and the relationship between an agent and their environment. And it was around, it was kind of, I remember it was very specific actually. It was in January, it was just after Christmas. I took
Hmm.
a special seminar series with some guest lecturers coming in to run seminars. And one of those guest lecturers was Dr. Mark Miller, who's currently at the University of Toronto. And that was my first exposure to predictive processing. And it was a real kind of light bulb moment. I was kind of tired and I wouldn't say disillusioned, but I was a little bit I was scrabbling around for inspiration for my master's dissertation. And so when I had that seminar and was exposed to this framework, it seemed to have aspects to it that were very exciting in various ways. And so that since then, basically pretty much all I do is predictive processing.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Let's dive into then predictive processing. So, what is the theory behind it?
Is essentially a theory of brain function. One of the reasons I was really attracted to it is because theoretical cognitive science, up until then, um, a lot of the work going on didn't really have a central theory of like how the brain is processing information. And predictive processing is just that. So it basically tries to explain how the brain is processing information. So it's a theory of it's on a computational level. So
Mhm.
obviously the brain has to deal with information and it's processing it in some way such that it can produce correct outputs. And this has always been something of a mystery. And so that's what predictive processing aims to explain. And I think like to understand why it's so striking, it's maybe best to understand it in comparison with older theories. So
Mhm.
up until I mean, some different forms of predicting process, some forms, adjacent theories have been around for some time, even kind of going back to the beginning of the 20th century. But I think the general picture, if you look in neuroscience textbooks up until fairly recently, you will find a kind of bottom up picture of information processing.
Mhm.
So what that means is if you take the example of just visual processing, okay, so I have a water bottle in front of me.
Mhm.
The older theories basically say that the light from that water bottle hits my retina and then it's processed backwards right to the most kind of rearmost part of my brain, the visual cortex. And then there are kind of 5 layers to the visual cortex, and it's processed in increasing levels of abstraction. So
Mhm.
most basic is kind of edge perception and depth perception, and then it's kind of increasingly abstract, kind of what object is this, like what is the context, that kind of stuff. Predictive processing turns that upside down. So it basically says that it's a kind of top down kind of flow where what's actually happening is the brain is actively anticipating what it's going to see, and it predicts the input that it's going to get. It predicts its own sensory state, and then
Mm.
the function, the quantity that it actually computes is prediction error. So where are those predictions going wrong? Error signals come back, and then the brain revises its predictions to kind of better account for for what it's experiencing.
Mhm.
Interestingly, this is, I mean, we can maybe, I mean, there's a lot of work going on in terms of kind of empirical evidence for this theory, and I think the empirical evidence is good. But one interesting observation is that the anatomy of the brain kind of bears this out. So if you actually look at the wiring in the brain, there are about 4 times as many connections from the back to the front than there are
Okay.
the other way. Essentially, what predictive processing says is that the brain has a model of the world. It's called a generative model, and this is made up of expectations or priors.
Mhm.
Based on those priors, the brain generates predictions, kind of hierarchical way. And the fundamental job, the business that the brain is in minimizing prediction errors. So it's trying
Yeah.
to, as best it can, model to predict, to model accurately such that it can predict its own sensory states. Um,
Yeah.
and we can kind of, I don't know how much detail you want to go into here, but there's some kind of more key elements of this theory that we can explore.
We can touch a little bit, maybe kind of the surface level. If you want, we can get into it, and then yeah, we can see how it goes
Well, one
after.
thing that I
Yeah.
would say, one of the most exciting things about predictive
Yeah.
processing, really, like, I mean,
Mhm.
for in kind of one of the major taglines of the theory is when you turn this information processing picture on its head, something quite shocking happens. So basically, PP says that what we experience, the kind of conscious sensory experience that we have, is
Mhm.
not, um, you're not experiencing the world directly. What you
Yeah.
actually experience is your revised predictions. So what you actually experience is the model of the world once that the prediction errors have kind of been cleaned up. So your brain is maintaining this kind of sensory experience, but
Mhm.
that's based on the accurate predictions that it's making. And so one of the famous taglines for predictive processing is that perception is a kind of controlled hallucination. You know, obviously this connects with a lot of older ideas in philosophy about the kind of veridicality of experience and how questions about, you know, how do you know what your experience is real?
Yeah.
And it kind of opens up interesting questions about how we might be able to hack certain aspects of our model and our experience. Um, but it's a kind of provocative tagline. I mean, obviously, we are anchored in reality. Okay, so
Yeah.
it's not that we all just have completely different models that are free floating. Um, but that's one of the most kind of philosophically kind of flashy aspects of the theory.
Yeah, because also, for example, with reality, also what you are saying, if I'm correct, right, is that like everyone perceives reality based on the model that they have for the world, right? So can we say it's a fixed reality, or like how we grow up, we start having fixed realities of like, okay, this is a bottle of water, this is a piece of paper, something like that, right? Would you say that's the kind of the case as well as we grow up?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, we aspects of concrete reality
Mm.
ground the expectations that we have, and kind of intersubjective experience and agreement on those kind of fixed aspects of reality are kind of, in what you might say, kind of like for healthy agents, are shared for sure.
Yeah.
But there's an interesting question about kind of like processing hierarchy at higher levels of abstraction in terms of like how we interpret certain events, how things feel for us.
Hmm.
These things, I think, are heavily influenced by our expectations in ways that I'm sure we're going to kind of unpack this as we
Yeah.
kind of move on further.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, it's not to say that the external world doesn't matter,
Hmm.
because it does, because that's what's giving us feedback, and that's where the prediction error is being generated.
Hmm.
But it's just the power of expectations, the power of that top-down influence on this theory is much greater than it would be for the kind of bottom-up theories.
perspective. Yeah, you have done like two podcasts as well, and I listened both of them with Mohan. Um, and you talk about like, yeah, you talk about certainty and uncertainty, and how, for example, neuroscience says that in order for us to grow, we need to kind of be in uncertain environment. Can you talk about that as well a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, it's just to say that uncertainty is where learning happens. So if you want to learn about any kind of scenario or aspects of yourself, or learn new skills, or to learn anything really, like the fastest learning rates happen in situations where there's uncertainty. So, in terms of kind of useful insights that can be gleaned from predictive processing, I think on this view, you can think of certainty almost as a kind of force of nature. So
Hmm.
living systems, organisms, they kind of tend towards certainty just as a kind of imperative matter, because if you want to maintain your integrity, your organizational structure, that just is synonymous with occupying expected sensory states. So certainty has this almost gravitational pull for organisms. So if living systems that don't occupy expected states die. However,
Hmm.
there is a really interesting caveat to this, which is it seems as though uncertainty has a particular kind of value for us. And so the best things in life are kind of where we, for a temporary period, in a fairly controlled way, can
Hmm.
violate that progression towards certainty. Kind of like, if you think about the analogy with gravity, it's kind of like, where we can temporarily board an aeroplane and for a short time kind of fly to our advantage. Uncertainty on the predictive processing has a particular kind of value, but it's probably worth saying that there are different kinds of uncertainty.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
there is, and I should reference a particular. So there's a really useful article. So if any of the listeners are interested in reading more about this, there's an article in Aeon magazine called "The Value of Uncertainty" by
Okay.
Andy Clark, Mark Miller, Kate Nave, and George Dean.
Hmm.
And this is broken down in more detail there. So essentially, the three kinds of uncertainty are expected uncertainty, unexpected uncertainty, and volatility. Expected uncertainty is just uncertainty that you expect to be associated with a certain task. So I think the example they use in the magazine article is imagine that I can navigate my way home in a city, but I have to go via a particular waypoint. So there's a particular,
Hmm.
it might not be the most direct route home, but it's the route that is kind of most simple for me because it most effectively minimizes uncertainty. But
Yeah.
you expect there's a degree of uncertainty to come with that, and that's why
Hmm.
you kind of take that particular route.
Yeah.
The same with anything. I mean, when I sit down to work on a paper, there's a certain amount of uncertainty around that I know is coming. So it's not the uncertainty itself is not surprising to me,
Yeah.
and so it's experienced as not particularly exciting, not particularly stressful. It's just a kind of expected obstacle. It's a part of the process. Unexpected uncertainty is um, that's the uncertainty where the learning rate is highest. So we're going to talk later about flow states and that
Hmm.
kind of stuff, but unexpected uncertainty is basically kind of surprising uncertainty that has to be dealt with in the moment. So it requires a certain kind of adaptation.
Hmm.
So if you imagine in kind of video game terms, like as you progress in levels, the video game is going to introduce new difficulties, the sort of the character of which you don't really understand until you face it. And
Hmm.
so, and again, in the context of flow states, which we'll come to, I think that's why video games are so good
Yeah.
in these kinds of flow states. So again, we were chatting a little bit earlier about learning languages.
Yeah.
And these things that seem like they're fulfilling tasks and where you feel like you're growing and learning something new and adding things to your character. Typically, that's going to be because you're confronting yourself with forms of unexpected uncertainty. Volatility, though, is very interesting. and it's a kind of necessary component of understanding unexpected uncertainty. So volatility is bad for us. And what volatility means is that the levels of uncertainty itself is unpredictable. So that's where the kind of uncertainty landscape is itself changing in ways that you can't get an epistemic grip on. The typically very stressful situations. So Mark Miller often uses the example of a war zone where the kind of the variables in the background that are dictating the uncertainty are themselves changing. So for example,
I see.
learning a language, you can be there are lots of kind of hidden uncertainties there, hidden challenges, and you have to kind of learn the structure of the task as you do it. But you have a kind of higher level understanding, a kind of higher level expectation of the kind of task you're going into, and you understand that it's going to be challenging in a certain kind of way. But if you imagine there are situations where you don't even know the uncertainty landscape, and you don't know how rapidly that uncertainty landscape is going to change,
Mm,
that means you can kind of never get a grip on the situation. There's literature that links our capacity to manage uncertainty with emotions and moods and psychological
mhm.
health. And so
Yeah.
there's work that links volatility to forms of psychopathology like anxiety, PTSD, depression. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah.
volatility is bad.
Uh-huh.
Expected uncertainty is good. Um,
Yeah.
so not all uncertainty is equal under predictive
Mhm.
processing, basically.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting when you started talking about volatility in a like a war kind of like perspective. I wrote down like PTSD
Yeah, yeah,
question mark. I was like, oh yeah, it does make sense because like for example, if your brain cannot get a grip of what's coming next, you're putting I guess your body in a constant state of stress because it doesn't know what's gonna come next because it's so uncertain. And then also, what I was thinking, can we link that with casinos? Like, let's say, for example, like playing roulette. Of course, like in a different completely example, but like it has volatility because you don't know and you cannot predict what number it's gonna hit.
well, a casino is kind of on a broader level. A casino, when you enter into a casino, you are, if you're well acquainted with the kinds of games that there are in a casino, you have quite useful, accurate expectations about the kinds of
Mm.
uncertainty that you're going to be confronted with.
Yeah.
So I would say casinos, for most people, are not going to be experienced as a volatile environment. They're an environment in which uncertainty has been engineered in a certain way um,
Uh,
to be as arousing as possible because kind of unexpected rewards are particularly enticing to us. In fact, there's a lot of research on this, and there's a particular kind of, a particular ratio, a particular level, sweet spot of the uncertainty of the reward that games designers, and I'm sure we'll talk about social media as well,
yeah.
that people
Yeah.
who design social media platforms use this research to kind of engineer the uncertainty dynamics on those platforms.
Yeah.
But volatility is a kind of unpredictableness at the highest level. So I mean,
Yeah.
it would kind of be okay, we're going to go into a casino, but every 15 minutes, the games are going to be rigged in a different way, and we're not going to tell you how they're going to be rigged. So, so you can sit down and play roulette or blackjack, but we're going to fiddle with the things in the background. We're going to weight the dice and wait and rig the wheel, and we're not
Yeah.
going to tell you, which means so even with roulette is it's a game of uncertainty, it's a game of chance, but you
Mm.
know that I think it's what is it, you have like a 1 in 36 chance
Yeah.
of hitting your number, but what if that kept changing and you didn't know it? That would mean
Yeah.
that you could never get a good epistemic grip on the situation.
Okay.
That's volatility.
That's volatility. Okay. And then you like the last question about volatility. Do you measure it with like low, mid, and high? Like, as a chart, let's say, for example, low volatility, mid volatility, and high volatility.
um,
So,
I mean, some situations are more volatile than others.
yeah. Okay.
To
Fair
my
enough.
knowledge, I mean, nobody has come up with like an official volatility scale. I mean,
I see.
uncertainty itself is, the level of kind of predictive processing and the sort of conceptual level, it's difficult to kind of quantify in real world terms.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, certainly some situations are more volatile than others, and we could talk about kind of low level volatility, but it's maybe best measured just in terms of the effects on the agent. So, like you
Hmm.
mentioned, dealing with volatility can be very stressful, and that stress manifests biologically in the body's vital systems operating beyond their usual set points. So
Yeah.
it's literally physically damaging to exist in a volatile situation.
Yeah. Psychological. Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
I can
stress causes all kinds of illness. I mean, we
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is really bad for you. So
Yeah.
if you're constantly going through life facing unmanageable uncertainty,
Mm.
that's basically stress, and it's super bad for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I do agree with you. And like the thing is, like I had a previous conversation with a psychotherapist and etc., and we were talking about anxiety. And I think, like in general, like even today, like the young generation has so much stress. Like the levels of stress have increased in younger people, and it's like, why? And I don't know if it's because the world is becoming more uncertain, or like it's the career, or it's the pressure that they have from society and etc., that makes their environment uncertain and stressful.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, it's an interesting question. So it could be that the world itself is becoming more volatile and
mm,
with more uncertain, but it could also be changes in the expectations, the way
yeah,
that people are, the expectations that we kind of encode in our model and the predictions that we're making could be um, less fit
yeah,
to minimize whatever uncertainty there is there.
yeah. When we are talking about like certainty and uncertainty, right? How can we put ourselves in a uncertain environment to grow, and how can we find the balance between the certainty and uncertainty?
That's a great question. And it's something I think about a lot personally. I'm somebody that enjoys, I think I have a fairly high threshold for uncertainty. And I know
Mhm.
that there are certain kind of forms of uncertainty that I really enjoy and I feel drawn to. I think everybody's threshold for uncertainty is probably different and can be
Mhm.
characterized differently. I mean, in terms of personality traits, neuroticism is essentially a low threshold for uncertainty. So I think most people are kind of calibrated to deal with a certain degree of uncertainty. Um, like I said before, uncertainty is where learning happens. So
Yeah.
the brain's kind of adaptive plasticity is working best when we're confronted with a degree of like manageable uncertainty. You
Mhm.
want that uncertainty to ideally just at the cusp of your capabilities, right? If it's too
Yeah.
low, you get bored, and if it's too
Yeah.
high, you get stressed. Uh,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think part of well-being, part of a healthy life, is a certain kind of thirst for adventure, thirst for uncertainty, a thirst for
Yeah.
challenge. I think
Mm.
it's almost like a cliche, to say like, oh, you should be kind of operating outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we should. I think that's a good thing. As to how we do that, there are lots of different options. I
Yeah.
think one of
I,
the things I've been doing in my PhD work is looking at the way kind of adaptive smart technology can do that in targeted ways. But there's much simpler ways like taking up a new hobby, learning a new language, doing any kind of learning any kind of new skill. Yeah, anything that keeps you kind of challenged. Anything that there's lots of ways of doing that.
Yeah, I guess it's quite personal. Like when I was thinking of the question, I was like, okay, how can you be in an uncertain environment? But yeah, like I feel like a lot of people are just stay in their comfort zone, and they don't grow. And then it's like, what can I do to grow? And it's like, as you say, you need to get out of your comfort zone and like learn a new hobby, put yourself out there.
And that in itself, that capacity to deal with uncertainty, I think, is kind of like a muscle because your
Mm,
expectations are constantly being refined, and if you spend so long in a very certain, stable, predictable environment, oftentimes we can experience that as being bored. But I think you can also get too used to that, and you start to expect a certain degree of certainty, and so then even minimal challenges to that can seem quite daunting.
Yeah.
It's important to always kind of consistently be searching out this boundary between your capabilities and uncertainty. And sometimes that's
Mhm.
going to mean kind of being comfortable with failure.
Yeah.
I've done a bit of work on this with Laura Di Paolo. We published a paper called "Active Inference Goes to School," where we looked
Hmm.
at different educational methods and how children in different kinds of schools respond to mistakes. And it turns out that if you have an educational setting in which children are kind of consistently being asked to engage with uncertainty in their own on their own terms,
Hmm.
they actually respond differently to mistakes. So they have a much less negatively valenced response to getting things wrong. Actually, they experience mistakes as like a good thing because that's like a learning signal. Here's an opportunity for growth.
Yeah.
Whereas if kids in a more traditional schooling system where
Hmm.
things are much more rigid and that things are not as exploratory and there's a lower threshold for uncertainty, then all of a sudden when you get something wrong, it's the research shows that that's experienced in a much more negative way.
Mm.
So it's a kind of constant. I think it's a skill in itself to be able to
Yeah.
deal with uncertainty. And like you say, it's finding your flavor of uncertainty and finding like the your threshold for what you're comfortable with is an essential part of this, and it's going to be different for everybody. So I like to
Yeah.
think of this sometimes in terms of travel. So
Yeah.
everybody likes travel, but the kind of travel people like can vary massively. So I really like just kind of booking a flight to some random destination and not booking any accommodation until I get there,
Oh wow.
and switching off, stay in hostels and try
Yeah.
and do without GPS and just kind of wander
Hmm.
around. And some people find that really exciting, and other people find that incredibly stressful. And
I can imagine.
travel is a kind of nice, you can modulate the uncertainty of the
Mm.
trip in various ways.
Yeah. I like that example, to be honest. It's quite interesting example to give because like as you say, like with traveling, you can kind of like, increase it or decrease it depending on yourself. Moving on, and I think we touched on it as well a little bit with expectations versus reality, right? What do you think are some expectations people have built in today's society, and how can we become aware of those like expectations and again like kind of balance them out?
Well, I think this is closely related to questions around uncertainty.
Yep.
Um, I mean, under PP, expectations are basically everything. So it might sound as though, on the face of it, the best generative model to have under predictive processing is the most accurate one.
Hmm.
And accuracy is certainly important.
Yeah.
Um, but you also want a model that has, to live the best kind of life and to be willing to deal with uncertainty in all of these important ways. You also want a model that has a kind of general, mild, optimistic bias,
Hmm.
right? So, if I'm looking for new hobbies and new things to do, and I'm
Hmm.
trying to progress through my career in various stages, at each stage, you have to kind of have a slight optimistic bias. You have to cultivate an expectation that you can do a little bit better than expected.
Hmm.
Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to operate beyond that comfort zone. So,
Yeah.
slight optimistic bias is a good thing. You don't want a completely delusional model.
True.
Um,
Yeah.
Otherwise, because the thing is, the slight optimism is a good thing because oftentimes you're going to confirm those optimistic expectations. So
Hmm.
actually you can give that talk, you can do that performance, and even though
Yeah.
you're a bit nervous about it and maybe you've got some doubts, actually doing the thing is kind of within your capacity. And the
Yeah.
more that you have this bias and you engage with those new things, that you're going to update your beliefs so that there's this kind of incremental um, kind of progression. But you don't want to have delusional beliefs, because then what's going to happen is you're going to be consistently met with massive waves of prediction error and negative feedback and kind of incessant failure. which
Yeah.
in a healthy system is going to, in a healthy system that would revise your expectations downwards and
Hmm.
you get kind of dialed in and calibrated. But things can go wrong with expectations in various ways. There are different directions we can go in here. But
Hmm.
basically, a healthy system under PP, so well-being,
Yeah.
a big part of well-being is having expectations that are sensitive to feedback. So you want expectations that are optimistic, but you
Hmm.
also want expectations that are not rigid and divorced from reality. So
Yeah.
if I try and do something and it kind of let me try and think of an example here.
Maybe at the gym, something like, exercising, because like
Yeah,
I have
yeah,
that kind of
yeah.
written down. You can't expect, if you're just starting to exercise, you cannot expect to, bench press 100 kilos
Mm,
straight away. But maybe you can, you find your balance. Let's say it's 40 kilos, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Can you do 45? Would that be kind of the positive expectation?
Yeah, I think that's a good example. So maybe it's a slightly easier example with running. So like,
Okay, yeah.
let's say you've never run before and your goal is to run a 5K.
Hmm.
There are programs that do this really well. So Couch to 5K is really effective because like the program has been put together in a way such that it can kind of your expectations are never it never asks too much of you too quickly.
Yeah.
If you kind of on the first day that you manage to run a 5K, let's say you do it in 40 minutes to
Hmm.
run 5K, if you then immediately sign up for an ultra marathon, then you're going to be confronted with failure and disappointment and lots of
Mm.
prediction error. And so, if you fail to update your expectations in a way that's like sensitive to feedback,
Hmm.
you constantly are going to be met with prediction error.
Yeah.
And one danger of that then is you have this kind of meta level expectation where the only way that the system can then account for this prediction error is to
Mhm.
predict failure. Um,
Ah, okay.
and this
Interesting.
is precisely what is happening in computational models of depression.
I see.
Um,
Would that be also associated, because I know you did your thesis with social media,
uh,
right? So let's say you want to become a social media influencer, and you post a photo and it only gets like, 50 likes, but you expect it to get 1,000 because normally you get 1,000 likes. So you're like, oh, why did that only got 50 likes? I'm gonna delete it, find a different post, or
yeah,
something else.
Yeah, so the first work I did in predictive processing was on social media and psychopathology because I was interested in so in predictive processing you have these models of depression, anxiety, addiction, and they're
Mm.
these very rich multi-layered models that connect
Mhm.
phenomenology to computation to neurobiology. And on the other hand, you had these kind of like rather sort of sketchy, anecdotal, somewhat questionable empirical findings that linked social media with these forms of psychopathology. But there
Mm.
was no like underlying theory
Yeah.
for this stuff. So I wanted to kind of use predictive processing to provide the theory
Mhm.
there. And I think it worked really well. One really crucial thing before we talk about social media is to say that when we talk about expectations here, we're not talking even primarily about conscious expectations necessarily.
Okay.
So we're talking so expectations can be subpersonal. Predictive
Mhm.
processing expectations are just essentially probability distributions
Mhm.
in the model. Um, so there's some really, so I think that social media essentially is a very effective generator of bad evidence. So we said
Yeah.
before, you want a generative model that kind of more or less tracks your environment and is more or less kind of accurate. I
Mhm.
think what happens when we spend a lot of time on social media is that it's not like this for everybody, but it can essentially drown you in a hose of a certain kind of evidence that installs expectations such that when you go offline, those expectations are not being kind of met in reality, and that leads to prediction error and uncertainty that can kind of go wrong in various different ways.
Mm.
Just to kind of illustrate this point about subpersonal expectations, so there's some really interesting work on body dysmorphia and social
Mhm.
media that tried to trial certain methods for improving or kind of diminishing the link between social media and self-reported negative body image,
Mhm.
because this is a well-established link. And so in these studies, they introduced factors like warning labels on certain social media posts and kind of reminders saying, hey, this image that you're looking at has been staged or
Edited.
edited or doctored. And,
Yeah.
and the kind of research that's been done here shows that this makes no difference whatsoever.
Really?
So
So when you look,
the knowledge that it's
uh-huh.
because, of course, like we all know, right? So like
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I deleted my Instagram because I was constantly being bombarded with a bunch of stuff that just made me kind of miserable and
Yep.
more aware of my own self-image and more aware of my kind of the life I was living wasn't kind of spectacularly like exciting.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I never was unaware that this content was dodgy in some way.
yeah,
Like I always knew like the fitness influencers. I know they have perfect lighting. The picture's been taken
yeah,
1,000 times. Most of them are on steroids anyway.
yeah,
There are apps that can kind of edit these photos, and I
yeah,
know that it's all curated. But I think
yeah.
that the point that's really important to make is that it doesn't matter to a lot of people.
Wow. So even if you know that it's fake, your brain does not recognize the fakeness, and you still kind of think that it's true
Yeah,
in that sense.
your
Yeah,
brain is your brain is always absorbing evidence
yeah, yeah, yeah,
on a much more universal, constant level than you're consciously doing. So
yeah,
sometimes it's conscious. Sometimes you're looking for evidence for a certain hypothesis, and
yeah,
then you update your beliefs accordingly, uh,
yeah,
more or less rationally, right?
yeah,
But actually, your brain is this is the brain's job. This is what it's doing.
mm,
It's like constantly refining its model by unconsciously kind of absorbing evidence from the world.
yeah,
And if you're spending a lot of time in a space where that evidence is not representative of like the wider, I don't want to say kind of like the real and the non-real world, because that's
okay,
a little bit of a fraught distinction, but let's say the
mhm,
offline world,
yeah,
then that can be quite dangerous.
mm,
There's a direct link there to depression, which is this kind of unresolvable prediction error that then leads you then learn that you're unable to engage with the world in an effective way. So yeah, I think that
yeah,
social media in some ways is we call it in one paper we wrote. It's a digital crowbar for kind of prizing apart your generative model from the offline world.
yeah,
And
yeah.
in some cases, like there's been a huge rise in
Interesting.
plastic surgery
Yeah,
requests. So people kind of either bringing in filtered images of themselves or requesting to look like particular filters. I forget the specific numbers on that, but it's a huge increase.
yeah. And is that over the what, like 5, 10 years, kind of?
I forget the exact figures. I'll plug my own Aon article here. So there's an Aon article I wrote with Mark
Yes.
called "The Warped Self," where we take a deep dive into Snapchat surgery and because in these cases where this goes badly wrong, you're essentially putting yourself in a kind of bind because so if I'm posting doctored images of myself
Yeah,
that are gaining all kinds of thousands of likes, loads of comments, tons of validation. And that's very rewarding. Social interaction and social validation is something that we really crave.
for sure.
And so if your expectations are then calibrated to
Hmm.
that, you go into the offline world where you're not filtered, you're not curated, you might look like crap one day, tired,
Yeah,
haggard, and you're not getting all that validation,
yeah,
then that can be quite stressful because it's a form of prediction error. You're violating these new expectations. And so this tendency towards certainty. The question is, how do you solve that? So it's you could update your expectations, but that's very hard to do if you're constantly spending time in that digital space. But the other way you can do it is you can essentially, and we'll maybe talk about this more later, but you can also, through active inference, you can essentially update the world rather than your expectations. So it's like, oh no, I'm just going to look like a filter all the time
Yeah.
by changing the way I actually look offline. And it's not to say, I should say that there's no principled issue with cosmetic surgery here. Like the claim that I want to make, it's not that like, oh look, cosmetic surgery is really bad and we should all be afraid of this. It's just it's a striking demonstration of the power of these platforms to alter our expectations, that people are taking like ostensibly quite drastic action.
Yeah. Yeah, to look a certain way, and to also, for example, maybe, because they're seeking validation. I think, like, when someone, like, for example, like, reaches the point of like having plastic surgery to look better on social media and, like, on their photos and etc., I feel like there's something underlying there as well, right? Like, from a mental perspective, like, there's something that they need to kind of, like, search internally and understand why they're doing that. Because, like, for example, everyone probably would want to correct something on themselves. We all have flaws, so we would love to fix them, right? But, like, what would that do? Like, okay, cool, you will be perfect, but then you will find the next thing. Oh, like, I have improved, let's say, my nose. Cool, let me do my teeth, or let me do my jaw. And then where does it stop? And if it never stops, then you will always constantly try to, find the next thing to improve. Like, there are, I don't know if you have read this, but there's like a real life Ken, and he has done like his abs, his chest, like he put like implants on his chest, on his abs, biceps, triceps, etc. And it's like, okay, but why why not go to the gym and achieve that naturally? you know it's like,
Yeah, this is. I mean, it kind of goes beyond my
no, 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 fair, yeah, of
realm
course.
of expertise, but it is an
Yeah.
interesting question. I mean, even before you get to cosmetic surgery,
Mhm.
professional bodybuilding. I mean, talking about the gym, professional
Yeah.
bodybuilding, where people take extreme, like very extreme aesthetic goals for which they're willing to sacrifice their long-term health and well-being,
Yeah.
um, because they have these, expectations installed about what a professional bodybuilder should look like. And
Yeah.
and bodybuilding, it's, I mean, weird that we're kind of going off on a bodybuilding tangent, but it's like it's it's testament to the power of like cultural scaffolding as well.
Yeah.
You create this kind of cultural niche of
Hmm.
professional bodybuilding that is quite a weird place, like just contingently historically has ended up at this quite strange place where
Yeah.
it has this, it's this kind of ecosystem of quite weird standards and expectations. And then people kind of, to minimize, if they have like a strong prior, like I'm going to be a successful professional bodybuilder,
Yeah.
and it's just a case of minimizing the relevant prediction error there by
Yeah.
engaging in those practices.
Yeah. 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 So how would you say we can balance our expectations? Like, when we are talking about social media, would you say just, spend more time offline, or, the example that you gave, and I have found myself in the same situation, just delete
Mm.
completely social media?
I think it's hard because everybody's different, and I know
Yeah.
people that use Instagram and they love it,
Yeah.
or they say they do. Yeah, sometimes I'm
Yeah.
skeptical, but
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely like not going to say like, oh, nobody should use social media, it's universally bad. Like it's, I think this is just a question of like applied wisdom and just
Mm.
self-reflection and self-knowledge, and just trying to be, I mean, it's difficult because social media is also, I do believe social media is also potentially addictive.
Yeah.
I know that there's, for me, it was a real challenge to delete social media because it's all well and good deleting it in a particular moment, but then you all of a sudden you're on a 2-hour bus ride, and we our attention spans have kind of been constricted by, social media gives you a lot of novelty very quickly,
Mhm.
in a very frictionless way. And so everything comes back to expectations. So if you've
Yeah.
been using Instagram and Twitter on your phone for a couple of years, you expect a certain kind of degree, like a rapidity of novelty, frictionless novelty, where I can just kind of scroll through endless memes or videos. And when you take that away, all of a sudden, trying to read like Tolstoy on a bus feels like failure. It feels like it.
Yeah.
Anybody, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this. When I was growing up, when I was a kid, I used to be able to sit and read 100+ pages quite easily.
Yeah.
30, 40 pages was nothing.
Yeah.
Whereas now, like if I try and read a novel and I put my
Mm.
phone to the side, actually 30 pages now feels quite stressful. Like I want to reach for my phone and I have to stop myself. And there's
Yes.
like this rising tension in me where
Yeah.
even though I love reading, it's becoming more difficult. So I don't think there's like a blanket imperative here.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's different when it comes to the people designing social media. I think people who are designing
Mm.
and building it should pay more attention to, like, they should be more mindful of certain responsibilities and the impact that what they're designing is having. But for users, I think it's just about cultivating certain habits. There's a great book by Professor Shannon Valor, The Techno Moral Virtues. It's a book on virtue ethics and emerging
Okay.
technology. She's at the University of Edinburgh. And this book is basically about what kinds of character traits and habits um, is it good for us to cultivate and aim towards in order to have a good relationship with technology that is, potentially has a bit of a dark side. And I think social media is one of those. Like it's really annoying when you're out for dinner or drinks with a friend and they're just on their phone the whole time, or
Mm.
you're with a partner and they're on social media too much. You feel kind of neglected, and so, in the book, I think she uses that as an example. And so you want to kind of cultivate a kind of, even, you don't have to delete all of your social media, but nevertheless, you should want to be a social media user who is
Mm.
not inattentive to the people you care about in certain situations.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, and I think it goes back to like the real life, like, sure, spend your time on social media, but then at the same time around people, be in the real world,
yeah, it
let's
goes
say.
back to kind of
Yeah.
classic, good old philosophy. It's there's nothing necessarily wrong with using social media, but you want to it folds that within questions about what kind of a person do you want to be and what is a good life. So
Yeah.
Aristotelian virtues like temperance and courage, and it's like, okay, yeah, if you can use social media in a way that isn't kind of degrading your character,
Hmm.
which obviously it doesn't for everybody, and in a way that you can honestly say isn't actually affecting your mood and making you kind of feel weird or miserable about the real world, then that's good.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I do agree. Um, we have already touched about it a little bit, but like regarding comparison, right? So, what do you believe comparison does to our reality?
Well, so I think I just reiterate some things I said.
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
don't think there's anything wrong with comparison per se.
hmm,
Like there's the famous comparison is the thief of joy. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with comparison per se, but I think there's something dangerous about where comparison leads to these overly rigid expectations.
yeah,
And like we said, they can be. This is all comes down to what kind of evidence are you imbibing from the world.
yeah,
So it's about being mindful of that and understanding that comparing yourself to other people can be fun sometimes, but you don't want to consistently occupy a space in which you are confronted by, um, you know, unattainable beauty standards or
yeah,
whatever they might be.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I do agree with you. I think I slowly start realizing that comparing myself to other people is not a good thing, and I should only compare myself with, you know, with myself a year ago. Am
Yeah.
I in a better position today than I was a year ago? If I am, happy days. And I continue growing, or
Mhm.
whatever. Yeah, rather than comparing myself with someone who's in a completely different path.
Yeah, and also
And
even with comparing yourself to yourself, recognizing that sometimes, the situation you were in a year ago might be completely different than the situation you're in now. So
yeah,
having some compassion for yourself, and um, yeah, I think it's certainly better to compare yourself to yourself than to other people. But even in that case, I think, be mindful of the role that the external environment can play. I mean, you're not a kind of free floating spirit. Like
yeah,
there are material realities.
yeah,
you know.
yeah, yeah. I do agree. Um, do you reckon predictive processing framework can help us with our New Year resolutions?
So I think predictive processing in its kind of vanilla, kind of just
Mhm.
computational brain function theory,
Okay.
um, probably not. But I'm going to stick a
Okay.
pin in that and come back to it. But what I
Okay.
will say is that most people that work in predictive processing, especially in a kind of like philosophy of cog sci area, they interpret PP in a 4E cognition way.
Mhm.
So I'll say what that is first. So
Yes.
4E cognition refers to a sort of revolutionary turn in cognitive science that took place kind of through the 90s into the early 2000s,
Mhm.
where real emphasis was put on the role that non-neural substrate or objects can play in cognitive processing. So
Mhm.
the 4E, or I should say 3E really, I'll leave inactivism aside. 3E cognition is embodied, embedded, and extended cognition.
Okay.
So embodied is refers to the role that the body plays in cognition.
Okay.
Embedded is the role the environment plays in cognition, and extended is the way that kind of particular tools and artifacts can come to partly constitute cognitive processing.
Mhm.
Now, I think in practical terms, if you really understand that cognition is embedded and extended,
Mhm.
then you can start to do things that can make discipline and motivation easier. So one of my favorite quotes within this like paradigm comes from David Kirsch, who's a cognitive scientist at UCSD, and he says distributed cognition tells us that when it comes to problem solving,
Mhm.
space is a resource to be managed in the same way that time and energy are resources to be managed. So if you have to, let's say you're cooking a really complicated recipe, right? You're trying to
Mhm.
impress your friend and there's lots of ingredients, there's pans on the go. So you have to think about time and energy resources. Energy is maybe not such a pressing concern when you're just cooking
Mhm.
food, but you have to think about time management. But
Yeah.
also, you can utilize space, right? So I could put the ingredients on the counter randomly, or
Yeah.
I could lay them out in the order I'm going to use them.
Uh-huh.
So you can rearrange material space in a way that makes a problem easier to solve. And there's been some work done on this in terms of like, there's some work on the extended will. So, like, for example, if you think about, let's say your New Year's resolution is going for a run, it might seem obvious to some people, but if you think in terms of distributed cognition, okay,
Mhm.
I'm gonna put my alarm clock on the other side of the room.
Mhm.
I'm going to lay out my running shoes and my shorts the night before neatly so I don't have to kind of rummage through a drawer because that's going to increase the energy costs of solving the problem.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think if you think in terms of like distributed embedded cognition, you can really get into the habit of sort of thinking externally and be like, okay, how can I use my material space in ways
Interesting.
that support my whatever goal I have, and it can make a huge difference. It can make a really
Yeah.
huge difference.
Yeah. But then also, like, for example, what you're also saying is like, breaking down the goal can also help us achieve it easier. Like minimizing the difficulty, right? As you say, like, I have my clothes ready, I have my shoes ready, I have put my alarm on the opposite side of the room, so I cannot just snooze it and, like, go back to sleep. All those things are like smaller steps of the bigger goal, which is to go for the run. in the
Yeah,
morning.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
yeah. Always break down big problems into smaller ones, and then think about the ways that you can offload the cognitive, energetic labor into the
yeah,
environment, and yeah,
in that way.
it can make a massive difference. Just rearranging, reorganizing your workspace
Mhm.
can make things much easier.
Yeah, and then it go. I guess it can. We can link it with expectations, right?
Yeah,
In one of your interviews with again Mohan, you're talking about the change of beliefs versus flattening the distribution, and it was like from Adam Saffron.
yeah. I think we were talking about psychedelics. I think,
Oh, yes, I believe so. I have written it down. If you have very strong expectations, we know from active inference that you're more likely to enact those expectations. What you want to do is flatten
mm,
those probability distributions so you're opening up a likely diversity of outcome.
yeah. So active inference basically is more or less synonymous with predictive processing, but predictive processing is actually it's more used in the um, philosophy literature, and
Yeah.
it refers to a kind of family of different theories, all of which,
Mhm.
conceptually speaking, are kind of doing the same thing. But then, like in technical terms, like in actual implementation, like in modeling terms,
Mhm.
um, there are different kinds of implementation, and active inference is one of those.
I
That's
see.
not really important for us. What I would say is that active inference also refers to something in predictive processing, which
Mhm.
is actively sampling the world to minimize prediction error.
Yeah.
So imagine, so for a quick example, imagine that you're running. So imagine that you expect to catch a bus at 8:59,
Yeah.
and you're walking to the bus stop,
Mhm.
and the bus is a little bit early, and you see it go past you, and you're gonna miss the bus.
Yeah.
So you could just update your expectations, right? You could just
Yeah.
say, "Oh, I'm gonna miss the bus."
Yeah.
And then you've minimized prediction error by
Mhm.
just updating your model. So in
Yeah.
predictive processing, that's called perceptual inference.
Okay.
It's more passive, okay? But actually, that's not generally how we operate. So what you would do is you would run for the bus, okay? So
Yes. I normally run for the bus. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Sometimes it's a
Miss
bit
it.
embarrassing, but if you want to catch the bus, you have to essentially change the state of the world to minimize your prediction error.
Yeah.
Okay,
I see what you mean.
and this is really important because we were going back to the kind of bias in expectations and this
Hmm.
to occupy expected sensory states. Some of these expected sensory states are really important. Okay, so
Hmm.
we all expect on a subpersonal level to have a core body temperature of about, was it 37 degrees Celsius or
Yeah.
something like that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's encoded as an expectation.
Hmm.
And if we start to get prediction error around that expectation, uh,
Hmm.
updating your expectations is not good. Right? You're just, if you fall into icy water and your core body temperature starts to drop, you don't want to just update your model to say, "Oh, we're really cold." Yeah, okay.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
You want to actively infer an expected body temperature, by
Yeah.
which I mean get out of the water,
Yeah.
run on the spot, go inside. So when we talk about active inference, we're talking about predictive systems that they're sort of hell bent on confirming their hypotheses. They don't
Yeah.
really care if the hypothesis is true. So one way to think about this is there's a paper by um, Jelle Brunberg and Julian Kiverstein and I think Eric Reitveld, called "The Anticipating Brain is Not a Scientist."
Okay.
This is
So that's
kind
good.
of
Yeah.
undermined the view, this kind of Helmholtzian view of the brain as a hypothesis tester.
Uh huh.
Actually, the brain is a crooked scientist, right? It's a scientist that is like, it has a hypothesis and then it's going to diddle the experiment to confirm the hypothesis.
Would that be close to confirmation bias, or are they related, or are they just completely
So,
different?
so confirmation bias as a psychological phenomenon is
Okay.
separate, but there is a connection here. So you would say, yeah, like when it comes to core priors like body temperature,
Mm.
breathing oxygen, anything to do with being alive,
Uh huh.
um, the body, like the system, has to have a strong confirmation bias. It
Gotcha.
has to sample
Yeah.
the world in ways that confirm its own existence. Because
Yeah.
if you don't do that, you're just going to die, because the environment is volatile and and dangerous and capricious. And as the environmental factors change, you have to
Mm.
continue to maintain an expected state through action.
Yeah. Yeah. Going back to chains of beliefs and flooding the distribution, I think the example that I had is like, let's say, for example, if you're an anxious person, right, depressed, or you have the self belief that, I'm worthless, I don't have any friends, therefore, like, quotes, I'm a loser, right?
Yeah.
I guess it would take a high amount of, willpower to change that belief. And can we say, okay, cool, now you need to change your beliefs, therefore you need to change your active inference? With that, how can we prevent ourselves, or how can we change our active inference? Are there ways that we can kind of like, yeah, get out of
Well, you want to,
negative
in the
beliefs?
case of like something like major depression,
Yeah.
where the condition is characterized by expectations around hopeless, like the phenomenology of major depression is like
Yeah.
hopelessness, inevitability of failure, lack of connection
Yeah.
with the world and with other people. And obviously, that is, in the kind of computational terms, that is borne out in certain probability distributions, certain expectations
Yeah.
about the inefficacy of one's own actions, and one's inability to kind of like effectively engage with the world in different
Hmm.
ways. And what characterizes depression is not those feelings per se. It would be weird if you never had those experiences for a limited amount of time. But what characterizes depression is that those things are sustained
Yeah.
consistently. So you're in this kind of stuck state where you have these rigid expectations, these
Hmm.
strong priors for your own inefficacy. And what you need to do is you need to actively infer the opposite of those things. So
Yeah.
you need to find a way to infer that you can engage effectively, that you can be social, that
Yeah.
you can find friends. But this is very hard when those expectations are really strong.
Yeah. They're very wired in our brain.
Yeah.
Then,
So treatments aim to intervene on that level. So you're essentially trying to destabilize those expectations. So
yeah.
one way of doing this is psychedelics.
Yeah.
Another way could be like
See.
CBT.
Yeah.
Essentially, like everything is kind of aiming towards that.
Yeah, 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 flattening. Yeah, I guess like another example, like an easier and maybe more relevant to us as well, would be kind of like, let's say dating, right? So if you think that like, oh, maybe you grew up and you didn't have a girlfriend, right? And then you start believing throughout the years that, oh yeah, I'm just not good looking, or yeah, I'm not good with girls, whatever. Therefore, you never pursue it. And then, you listen to this conversation and you're like, okay, let me try and change my active inference. And you start maybe dressing a little bit better, again going to the gym, and you start having evidence of, oh okay, something is going on here. You have girls like looking at you, etc. Would that be a way as well to go about changing our active inference?
Well, it's so I wouldn't. I'd be careful of the phrase. So you're changing the way that you're um, sampling the world. So it's not that you're changing your active inference. You're just engaging. You're actively inferring different expectations.
Okay, actively
So,
inferring. Hmm.
so in that case, you would one way to think about that would be, I think, that you would be increasing the uncertainty
Yeah.
or model of that situation. So what you've been doing so far hasn't been working for you. So
Hmm.
what you're going to do is go away and like twiddle the knobs a bit and try something completely different, and maybe it'll lead to different outcomes. So
Yeah.
that's a healthy response. That's what we were talking about earlier. Like it's very healthy to have expectations that are like sensitive to feedback,
Yeah.
not just in dating, but in anything. Like if you're in school and you're consistently getting bad grades, you then think, okay, like what am I doing here? Like how can I change what I'm doing in order to like find a different outcome? Your expectations are adaptive and
Yeah.
leading to different action policies
Hmm.
that are gonna at some point, hopefully, you're gonna find a way to effectively minimize that prediction error.
Yeah. 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 Hmm.
Yeah.
And then like also like that's the result that we call success, right? Like as long as you minimize the prediction error, in a way that can be called success. Do you reckon?
Uh, yes.
In
Yeah.
a way.
So, in broad strokes, kind of in rough terms, minimizing prediction error is successful,
Yeah.
but there's a big caveat there. In the case of depression, like we said, so depression is characterized by the expectation of failure.
Mm-hmm.
So the system has priors that strongly expect things to just be wrong all the time. And so depressive behaviors are a way of actively inferring those expectations. So
Mm-hmm.
if I expect to kind of have no friends and be isolated and for things to be hopeless, I start to stay at home. I
Yeah.
stop speaking to my friends. I don't want to try anything new. I'm just going to order the same takeout every day. And this is a way of confirming that particular self model, that world model where I am those things.
Yeah.
So in that case, you are effectively minimizing prediction error. So, like depressive
Mhm.
behavior is prediction error minimization. It's just that something's gone wrong somewhere. Like the agent world dynamic has become warped. And it's the same in the case of addiction, like drugs of addiction are, they're a way of minimizing prediction error very effectively.
Yeah.
If things are, I mean, we don't need to delve into this too much, but for a drug addict,
Hmm.
smoking whatever drug it is that they're addicted to is registered by the system as a massive spike in prediction error minimization.
Hmm.
So they come to expect states in which they're using drugs and they're around people that are using drugs. And so in that case, I mean, the dysfunction of addiction there is a dysfunction through which error minimization is bad for the agent.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you say we can put ourselves in that situation? You can start with like a few symptoms, right?
Hmm.
And then you can spiral down into depression because like depression is not like one day you wake up and you're depressed. It's a spiral, right?
Yeah.
So do we put ourselves into that spiral? I think it's a difficult question to answer, but like, do we put ourselves
Question.
into that spiral? Or
I mean, in terms of addiction, is an interesting kind of case study. Um, I think the answer. So I think addiction is a kind of vicious feedback loop,
mm,
and I think once a person becomes drawn into that cycle of self-destructive behavior, there is a sense in which they're the ones that are actively inferring their downfall. But there's a kind of bigger question that I think what you ask can be interpreted in a bigger way, which is what causes people to find themselves falling into that cycle in the first place? And there are probably multiple answers to that question. There's
yeah.
certainly a genetic component to addiction, but also environmental factors are a huge thing.
Hmm.
Trauma, childhood experiences, just the physical environment that
Yeah.
somebody finds themselves in. Addiction is a condition that is like profoundly scaffolded by material reality. But
Yeah.
it is true that addiction is a vicious cycle. I mean, it's somebody might begin using alcohol, for example, because they're going through a very difficult time in life.
Mm,
But then they find that alcohol actually kind of is an effective way to minimize like those unpleasant feelings.
yeah.
And if that is a strategy that is continued,
Mm,
the alcohol use then contributes to the worsening of those circumstances. So they might get negative feedback at work, their
mhm.
relationship might suffer. And all of a sudden, then when you stop drinking, you have to deal with that corrosive effect. Then it's like, oh,
Yeah.
well, everybody's angry at me, everything's going wrong. What am I going to do? What have I learned
Mm,
effective to minimize that prediction error?
yeah.
Alcohol. And so you use again, and it's this cycle of like use and trauma and use and trauma, and it becomes increasingly, alcoholism and addiction in general is a progressive condition that gets worse and worse.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah, yeah,
affected by chemical factors as well. So in the case of alcohol, I realize we're going off on a tangent here, but in the case of alcohol, you reach a certain point where withdrawal becomes life threatening. So there is this problem
yeah,
of like detox around alcohol, and particularly bad with alcohol, but also heroin and other drugs. And
yeah,
even withdrawal in behavioral addictions, it's really stressful to stop doing something that you've learned is an effective way to minimize uncertainty.
yeah. Yeah, 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 you're trying to minimize your coping mechanism, which is, let's say, for example, is alcohol, right? And it's so funny that you said that we're going into a tangent over here, like, as a conversation, but like, it's that awareness, right? You had the awareness to say, oh, okay, we were talking a little bit too much about alcohol, or, whatever. Yeah, I think it also starts with awareness, because, like, for example, I don't know, like, not that I have been depressed or anything like that, but I have seen myself for a period of time where, like, with a meal, I had to have a drink, an alcoholic drink. And I was like, maybe it was like for a month. And then I was like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? So then I stopped alcohol. And I think it was like a period of time that some things were not going well. Alcohol was, flattening my distribution, or like, it was like soothing because I would chill. And then I came out of it, but I had to become aware that that was the case. And I think, that's another component, awareness into that.
Yeah, I mean, it's alcohol there would be contributing to strengthening the prior. So in a way, it's actually kind of heightening the distribution, because the expectation is that alcohol is going to put you in this expected state where
Okay.
you find relief from stress, external stressors.
Hmm.
So every time you use alcohol and it actually fulfills that expectation, your prior is getting stronger. What would flatten the distribution there would be some kind of destabilizing intervention. So, I speak with a bit of experience here. Actually, the reason that you have to find a way to counteract that, and provide the agent with alternative ways of minimizing the uncertainty that they experience in the world.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that certain approaches to sobriety are so effective is because they do that. So, for example, like 12-step meetings,
Hmm.
what they do is they very effectively provide people with community and connection, and some of the things that they feel might be missing in their life. If you're an addict and you stop using, you're suddenly confronted with the loneliness, the lack of connection, the difficulties that you're having in life, and so you need to find a way to provide different avenues to meet
Yeah.
your needs. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. To change. Yeah. Um, Kind of moving on from active inference. This question does not relate with anything else we have talked so far, but like, I do find it interesting and important to discuss about. Do you think academia needs more or gets enough spotlight?
I would like to see work that happens in academia having more real world connection and focus.
Mm,
I think that both the real world and academia would benefit from stronger connective tissue.
yeah.
And I think that we could, certainly in this country, we could definitely, I don't want to get political, but we could
Yeah.
certainly do with a kind of change in how certain aspects of the academy are viewed, certainly kind of like the role of the humanities and the value of philosophy, and a kind of updated awareness of the intimate connection between STEM and the humanities. So yeah, I'm not sure about that kind of spotlight on academia, but
Hmm.
certainly I think updated beliefs, to put it in active inference terms, about the role of academia and what's going on could be useful. Yeah.
Yeah, because so basically the question came after a podcast with I think his name is Eric Weinstein. He's like an American mathematician or physicist, and the thing is, like, for me, it's just that, like, academia can play a positive role model for like young people, and because like right now, I think a lot of people do not have good role models. And I think, like, academia and like academics and etc. can be those, positive role models that young people, the younger generation, can have.
Well, yeah, I agree with you there. I think there's a lot of bad role models.
Yeah.
around for young people, especially
Yeah.
young men, especially
Yeah.
young men, very bad role models. And there certainly seems to be like a vacuum of good role when it comes to good role models.
Yeah.
And I think, I still have a lot of optimism around the role that philosophy could play. And I think the academy, academic philosophy has the potential there to maybe not fill the void of role models themselves, but it certainly has something to say about what it means to live a good life and the kinds of things we should value. And, it can provide an antidote to the kind of unrestrained avarice and machismo that seems to dominate that space. So I would like to see good role models come out of academia for sure.
Yeah.
Academia is not particularly glamorous. There's not a lot of people driving supercars in academia, so it's not very Instagrammable.
No, it's not. And I do think, like going back to our conversation, I think that's the point. Like, I think a lot of people, a lot of young men, let's call it, let's talk about men, like, yeah, they have like those negative role models because they think that the supercar is what they need to succeed in life. Whereas I don't believe so. I think, knowledge and having like a well rounded perspective is way more important.
Living a meaningful life
Yeah.
and pursuing goals that are meaningful, which may very likely to be less instantaneously gratifying, or even probably less acute in their delivery of like instantaneous well-being or feelings of happiness. Yeah, I mean, there are conversations to be had around what kinds of goals are worth pursuing, and I think social media does play a role in damaging those conversations because
Mm,
these conversations tend to be things that aren't served well by very short form content. So
yeah.
images of like ostentatious wealth are very easy to communicate through a 30-second TikTok video.
Yeah.
Conversations about purpose and
Hmm.
authenticity are not they're not served well by short form content.
No.
So I think the delivery mechanisms, digital delivery systems really matter. Right? Like
Yeah.
you can't have a conversation about human flourishing on TikTok.
Yeah.
I
And probably,
think you can anyway. I mean, I do know people personally who would kind of like push back against that, but I'd
yeah.
probably die on that hill.
Yeah. But then also like sort of form videos also reward the luxury, like what you're saying, because you can show within 30 seconds your supercar and your Rolex or, whatever, but you can't have a meaningful conversation in 30 seconds, like, and talk about the deep, yeah, the meaning of life or like, kind of like the more important topics.
Mm.
Do you think that social media will become a public health issue at some point?
I think it depends on the way you want to construe health.
Hmm.
I think it plausibly already is. The empirical evidence is contested. So there are some experimental psychologists who will tell you that there's this strong causal connection between social media and mental health issues. And then there are other researchers like Amy Orban from Cambridge who would say the evidence here isn't very good. But the anecdotal evidence is very strong and consistent. And I think we have strong theoretical reasons through predictive processing to assume that there is this potential link there. It's not just in terms of psychopathology. So it's not just the case that social media is linked with depression and anxiety. It's also what we were talking about earlier, which is what kinds of expectations do we want young people to cultivate?
Mm.
And again, I think there's this concern where the kind of content that is very viral and is spread very widely and seems to be very present on social media is
Hmm.
just very bad in an obvious way. It's vacuous, it's avaricious, it's vulgar,
Hmm.
and I'm talking about specific kinds of influences again, especially for young men. I mean, it's very. I mean, I think young women face their own challenges on social media as well. Around body image and beauty standards and
Hmm.
all kinds of kind of social pressures and things. But I think this is a real problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I think that the kinds of influence, the influence that social media is having, like I'm exposed to it. I mean, I don't have Instagram anymore, but even on, I'm lingering on Twitter. I'm on the
Yeah.
brink. I'm on the brink of leaving.
Yeah.
It's the content I get exposed to is appalling,
Yeah.
really, really bad, and I don't
It's,
engage with it. I don't cultivate that. I don't court it.
mm.
So yeah, I would say in a nutshell, I think this can be plausibly construed as a health issue.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. There's a Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma. So basically, I don't know if you have watched it, but it's quite interesting. And it shows, a family, a kid, and, he's on Instagram, whatever, and he starts watching like radical videos of like anti-immigration, you know what I mean? Like, etc. And then he goes into a rally, he protests. And I think, like, for example, I do wonder what will be a potential future if we continue using social media, especially for even the younger generation that grows up with it.
Yeah.
Kids who are like 2000, 2005,
Mm.
that grew up completely with social media, Facebook, Instagram, etc., TikTok, which is even more addictive because like their algorithm is trained with AI. So they know exactly how much time you spend on every reel, and they just feed you the content that you want.
Yeah,
It's mad.
highly adaptive technology, highly
Very.
adaptive technology. And I have some work out on this. Like my most recent paper is on the relationship between highly adaptive technology and the will and agency,
Hmm.
and how that connects actually quite deeply to personhood as well. I mean, I won't go into too much detail, but I think there's a case to be made that this kind of really adaptive technology actually erodes our personhood with
Yeah.
a very profound harm. When I have this conversation with people, it's common for people to say, "Oh, but I learned about this new thing that like somebody might say, oh well, it's through TikTok that I learned about the kind of like activism for a certain cause
Mm.
that I care about or something." So
Yeah.
again, I like feel like strongly have to reiterate multiple times. It's not, the claim isn't that it's all bad. Like it can,
Yeah.
there is content out there that people find very like illuminating or beneficial. But I think there's at least two levels of danger here. The first is like, even when the content is good, the
Mm.
delivery mechanism can be bad. Okay, so
Okay.
even if you're learning about something that is like kind of beneficial to you, I
Mm.
still think we could have a better platform than TikTok. Like
Yeah.
I don't think 15-second videos constantly are really conducive to well-being in some like broad way. But then there's the worry about the content itself as well.
Hmm.
So there's the bad content is a threat too.
Yes. Yeah, I have seen that personally. Well, funny enough. So basically, I want to start dancing again. So I used to do salsa, and now, like, I'm gonna start again in January. And Instagram started showing me dance videos,
Mhm.
and I would watch it, right? And now it hasn't been like 2 weeks, and now my feed on Instagram is like Spanish, because I'm learning Spanish, and salsa dances, at the steps in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
It's
It's crazy.
it's remarkable, yeah, and I mean, it's
Yeah.
obviously it can be very good, if it's making connections that are useful to you and kind of operating as this kind of extended epistemic agency, that
Mm.
can be really good. But I remember my Instagram was, I'm a fan of mixed martial arts, and so I
Hmm.
but as soon as I looked up MMA, the algorithm was like, "Oh, here's a load of stuff that is adjacent to MMA, which
Yeah.
is, it's quite right wing coded." And so
Ah.
it also assumed that I was some kind of, hyper conservative lunatic, which
Yeah.
is quite depressing. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions around the platforms, the kind of algorithms, this kind of hyper adaptivity, and how it relates to our kind of free agency and choice. And, like going back to Shannon Valler's work, like it's all good talking about certain virtues and good habits, but like when you have hyper adaptive, addictive technology, the primary function explicitly of which is to erode your capacity to resist,
Yeah.
then their intention, right? So if I want to, I say, okay, I'm going to use social media, but I want to do it in a way that is kind of characterized by temperance and wisdom.
Mhm.
That's all well and good, but if you're dealing with something like TikTok that is trying to pull your agency away from you,
Yeah.
then we need to have a conversation about the ethics of that technology.
Yeah, I do agree. So you said you're writing a paper right now. Is that going to be ready anytime soon,
The
or
paper I mentioned there is already out. It's called,
oh, is it because?
it's in the journal Topoi. It came out
Mhm.
this year. It's called, has a good title. It's called Techno Wontons Adaptive Technology and the Will of Tomorrow.
Okay, interesting.
um,
I'll give it a read.
I'm sure people can go and find that. But it's just,
Yeah.
in a nutshell, it's trying to precisely describe the kind of unique threat posed
Mm.
by hyperadaptive technology.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Do you think we are isolated today as a generation because of social media and technology, or do you think there's a broader range of social issues that makes us kind of isolated? And I take this from your interview with Mark Miller and Mahon. And like Mark says, we potentially enjoy spending time online because it's not awkward. Whereas if we pushed ourselves to have that awkward social interaction, that is what makes us human.
I mean, there's different ways to go with that. I agree with Mark's sentiment there. I think, well, I feel like I need to be very measured in what I say because I don't, it's again, it's not that I don't want to demonize online space and online interaction wholesale, but I think it's
Yeah.
certainly true, roughly speaking, that the stakes of online interaction feel lower. I mean, this is why it's
Mm,
much easier to use a dating app than to go and talk to someone in real life.
true. Yeah.
Yeah,
It
and I think
removes the
that's probably
awkwardness.
true
Yeah.
for most kind of online interactions. I mean, people. I mean, it's evidenced by the fact that people behave abominably online. You know, people say things to each other in comment sections that you'd never dream of saying to somebody's face. So, yeah, online platforms through their affordance, the unique kinds of affordances that they present, change the way that we interact with each other. Again, there are benefits to this.
Yeah.
It's a double-edged sword, you know. Like there are good things about social media, but
Mhm.
then again, yeah, I think it's the stakes seem a lot lower in some ways. You seem to be hinting towards a question about the specific challenges that young people face. Um,
Mhm.
Isolation is one. I think. I mean, I'd have to think more about isolation in particular. But I think one thing that I have thought about is there's a kind of like paradox here in that we are the technology that enriches and expands our worlds in some sense also leaves us more isolated because we tend to
Mhm.
communicate more online and we tend to fulfill certain social functions through applications. You know, dating apps are a good example of that. But at the same time, the expansion, the world that we view through social media and the world that is given to us through applications can make our offline world feel smaller. And it can also
Yeah.
encode expectations that are then difficult to meet. So
Mm.
the affordances on offer to me like vastly outstrip the affordances that were on offer to my grandfather. You know, like in terms of like I expect to travel the world, to try all kinds of
Yeah.
cuisine. I expect to be able to,
Yeah.
swipe through 300 people looking for a particular type of person rather than just kind of meet somebody down the pub and learn to love that person for various reasons. So I think like
Yeah.
the affordances of technology are really non-trivial, and but they have there's a
Yeah.
complexity there. So there's isolation and expansion, and like the kinds of the expectations can be for a much bigger world full of richer experience, but whether or not that's borne out in our actual life is contingent.
Yeah. And I guess it's very interesting what comparing generations, right? Basically, my grandfather grew up in one city, died in one city. You know what I mean? Like he traveled a little bit, but within Greece. But that's it. Whereas, like we have the capacity to travel the world, work somewhere else, live somewhere else. Whereas, like previous generations did not really have that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, we certainly have the expectations for that.
Yeah. Hmm.
And this is where it can become a problem. If you don't need to be on social media to know that like traveling is like much easier and much more normal these days. And especially if you're on social media, you see all of these exotic places and Instagrammable locations, and you think, oh, it's like a
Yeah,
it's the expectation is that this is something people do. There's a high likelihood of me being able to
yeah,
engage in this kind of stuff. But actually, it turns out, if you don't earn enough money or you don't have like the spare time, if you're not actually an Instagram influencer, it's not that easy to do this
yeah,
stuff. And most people in their real lives don't have the capacity to travel as much as they would like to. So yeah.
yeah. And then that can also, spiral down because, for example, this is kind of a nice question. It's like, who puts those expectations? Or is it just ourselves, right? Like, I expect to travel the world. Let's go with that example. Okay, perfect. Okay, the flights are like £2,000. Okay, now I need to work. I need to save £2,000. Okay, I went to the trip. But then, oh, wow, like on Instagram, there's another place. Okay, cool. 6 months, I will work, go to the other trip, and you have all those expectations, and on top of that, you have other things apart of only traveling, right? You have your basic needs and whatever. So yeah, I do wonder if it's something that we put to ourselves, or it's and we get influenced by society.
I think it's mostly the latter. I think our
Yeah.
expectations are heavily scaffolded by what we see around us, and kind of not just what you see on social media, and not just in that very direct way, but just in terms of cultural norms as well. I mean, even when you think you've come up with a kind of expectation yourself, even that doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Hmm.
I mean, you live in a sort of what Wittgenstein called a form of life, which is made up of all of these like
Hmm.
patterns of cultural activity, which are themselves kind of expectations. And all of this is learned by inferring what other people expect of you. So it's,
Yeah.
true originality is like really hard to come by.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess fair enough. I think we can delve into this topic even more, but like the last one is like, that's why I think it's also important to balance our expectations, right? Because you can't have the expectation, as you say, to travel the world and become,
Yeah.
a full-time traveler. You need money for that, right? And there are so many exotic places, like, will you ever go to all those exotic places? And then you have to kind of like balance your expectations and be like, okay,
Yeah.
no. I would love to also talk about the meaning crisis, because I think you have done some work with John um,
So
Vervaeke,
John
if I pronounce this.
Vervaeke has a YouTube series on the meaning crisis. It's a series of lectures, and has published a book with a co-author whose name I can't recall right now, but it's on kind of the symbolic role of the zombie in Western culture and how that speaks to a perceived meaning crisis. I have not published any work with John on this.
Hmm.
Um, I kind of
Yep.
I do. I'm working with a few people at University of Toronto right now, and John's involved in some of those projects, but they're kind of in the
Hmm.
pipeline. The meaning crisis is something that
Hmm.
I've been increasingly kind of drawn towards.
So, what would you say is the meaning crisis? And, according to John, is it to achieve the
Well,
flow
so the
state?
meaning crisis itself is there seems to be a widely shared perceived lack of meaning in our lives. And for John, this is kind of borne out in statistics around mental health and psychopathology. Like
Mm.
in the West now, kind of. I forget the exact figures, but it's John has some wonderful talks on YouTube about this. But it's something like 90% of people feel
Mhm.
like their work is meaningless, or their job is meaningless, or rates of depression,
Yeah.
anxiety, um, all of this stuff is kind of skyrocketing. And the meaning crisis refers to the fact that, well, the hypothesis is that this is the result of fewer avenues and opportunities to find meaning in the world. So
Mm.
John talks about this kind of mismatch between agent and arena, where the arena used to provide quite direct avenues to find purpose and kind of agency and fulfillment. And now we live in worlds that seem to be disconnected from us in certain ways. So,
Yeah.
and there's all kinds of things to say about this. I mean, and there's this question of like,
Yeah.
what is meaning? So the first thing to say is that meaning comes apart from subjective well-being. So they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
So something could be bad for your subjective well-being, but could be really meaningful.
Hmm.
And in fact, like I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I think so. John argues that they're not reducible to one another, but I think there's quite a
Hmm.
strong kind of negative relationship between them. I think that things that tend to feel really good tend to be, at least for me, tend to be kind of like frivolous and not particularly meaningful. I think meaningful things can feel good, but for the most part, what
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
like over the longer term, they're characterized by struggle and various different kinds of hardship. You think about kind of learning martial arts or training in the gym. These are kind of meaningful
Hmm.
projects. They provide a sense of like efficacy
Yeah.
and purpose and a sense of belonging as well, even within that particular arena. But like to do well at those things takes like there's massive energy costs. You're going to have to deal with waves of prediction error when you fail at certain things. It might include physical injury, fatigue. Certainly training in the gym is like an interesting case because people tend to feel on the long term like that's a really good, fun thing to do. People want to go to the gym, but
Yeah.
actually, when you're lifting weights, it's
Yeah.
like quite unpleasant. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, as an so training, hard training in the gym, like context plays a huge role in how we interpret those feelings. So, like when you do a really hard run and your heart's beating and it feels like the blood's on fire,
Hmm.
that feels good because it's happening in the kind of top down
Mm.
context of, oh, I'm engaging in this meaningful kind of practice. Whereas, like I think Andy Clark has said before, like if you woke up in the middle of the night with that feeling, you just call an ambulance. Like you just, no, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, that's the
Yeah.
first thing. There's this interesting relationship between subjective well-being and meaning. Um,
Hmm.
meaningful projects are, like again, all of this is coming from John Maveki. Projects where the object of which you care about beyond your own existence. So they're things that you would want to carry on even if you weren't here. And you have some kind
Yeah.
of like effective agency in the cultivation of that thing. So having a child, for example, is a really
Yeah.
good example, or running a charity, or some things like this, where you're not doing it just because it
Yeah.
feels good. Actually, a lot of the time, it's kind of a pain and hassle and stressful, but you have an
Hmm.
effective role in something that you feel does good beyond just making you feel good.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with you because, like, for example, like, kind of like my meaning, let's say, or currently my meaning would be this podcast because I feel like, by posting these, episodes online for other people to find and, like, listen to, I feel like I have a meaning beyond myself. And I don't know if, like, let's say, for example, we can say that meaning, or like, what's the meaning of life, right? Is it like, can we say like it's biologically, we know it's only to, survive and reproduce. But in today's society that we have done that, like we have the clothes, we have the warm
Yeah.
houses, etc. We need to find a new meaning of life now,
I would
right? It's not only
say
survival.
to ask him what is the meaning of life is kind of just the wrong. It's a dysfunctional question. I'm heavily influenced by like
Yeah.
existential philosophy here. So like existential philosophy. I think
Uh-huh.
like to me it rings really hollow to say the meaning of life is these kind of biological drives. Like there's a sense in which that's true, but it's a very kind of impoverished
Hmm.
sense of meaning. We don't that's not how
Hmm.
we experience life when we crave meaning and we're hungry for meaning. The thinking in terms of evolutionary imperatives is not particularly fulfilling. So I think, like,
Hmm.
what is the meaning of life is just a red herring question. It's just like, actually, philosophers like Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir, like these kind of core existential movement, I think they were right when they said that actually, in terms of like life itself has no meaning. There is no given meaning to life. This is what Camus
Yeah.
described as the absurd. It's the sense that you have this hunger for meaning. There's this sense that life must have some kind of meaning, and yet there is none to be found. There is nothing given to you on a plate of the universe.
Yeah.
But the exhilarating insight there is that actually meaning, you have this kind of, they don't use this term, but I would describe it as a kind of process theory of meaning, where rather than just a state
Hmm.
that you achieve, meaning is this kind of
Hmm.
ongoing process of construction where you the project is to live, to find your values and then live them
Hmm.
authentically in the face of difficulty and hardship. um, um, and that's basically, that's where you meaning is something that you have to actively infer, right? It's a process of active inference. Okay, you have this expectation for meaning and it's not there, so you have to wrench it from the kind of tremendous authority of that which actually exists, right, which is meaningless, but you have
Yeah.
to make it meaningful. So
Yeah, yeah, no, I do agree. And the last one on that is that you can find also meaning with your friendships, and then you can probably we can associate like social media, right? Like we are more isolated as people, therefore, like maybe we have lost the meaning of or purpose, whatever, and we maybe need to reconnect with like the real world. Like just live life rather than like scroll through life. We need to go out and live it, like either it is like mixed martial arts and like get to know people there and get meet people, be kind of in that flow state that John describes, that like where you want to be is like slightly outside your comfort zone, and
yeah.
that's where you will.
Yeah, it comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning with there are crucial elements here,
Yeah.
different threads that you can bring together. One of them is, I think it's important to have a reliable source of resolvable uncertainty in your
Hmm.
life, which is, ideally puts you in a kind of flow state where you're at that kind of Goldilocks zone where the challenge and your skills kind of come together in this really nice way. Being regularly being in a flow state is positively correlated with a sense of meaning in
Yeah.
life. This is something that John talks about. Yeah, I used to play a lot of video games and then I
Mhm.
stopped because flow state itself, I think, is quite addictive. And I think that there's like, these are conceivable scenarios where I don't think flow on its own is enough. Like, maybe people would disagree with me here, but I think like flow states alone, they're not a source of meaning in and of themselves. I think they have to take place within a context of connection and belonging, and
Yeah.
what the existentialists talk about, which is authenticity, living your values authentically. So
Mm.
yes, playing Counter Strike 7 hours a day put me in a reliable flow state, but there was
Yeah.
this kind of meta level realization that I wasn't really living the kind of life that I wanted to live. Being in that flow state was not manifesting my values of adventurousness and
Mm.
authenticity and challenge. Like, yes, the game is challenging, but when you get to a certain skill level, like, how far are you going to push that in a way that continues to be rewarding? The picture here is really complex, but
It's
I
interesting.
think I think the 20th century existentialists had it. People need to go and read Camus on this topic. You have to manufacture your own meaning, and I think most fundamentally
Hmm.
that is a project of deciding what's important to you, what are your
Hmm.
values, and then living authentically in service of those values. And if you try and do that, then you'll find that in itself, that is challenging enough on its own.
Yeah. And you can find meaning within those two. Yeah. What would you say between self improvement, growth, and self awareness? What's the best way to look life between those three
Oh, so
things.
growth and self-improvement, what's the difference between those in your mind?
Yeah, how I go about it. Self improvement will be constantly trying to improve yourself, find flaws
Right.
within, so like for example, I'm skinny.
Mhm.
I'm gonna go to the gym because I need to build muscle. Finding anything in in yourself that is faulty, right? Even mentally, oh, like I'm anxious, I need to fix it. Let me read a book.
Mm,
So that's self-improvement, right? Growth would be to take a like a, broader perspective and say, oh, I will go to the gym because it's healthy for me, right? Like, it's good to have flexibility. It's good to have muscles because like then I can lift heavier, or I can do stuff, right? And it's also good for long term, as I get older. And then self-awareness would be, yeah, self-awareness.
yeah. Yeah, I like that. I mean, so growth there sounds like it could even, a form of growth could be recognizing that some of your flaws actually, it's better to kind of accept flaws rather than try too hard to change everything about yourself that you don't like. There's a kind of role for self compassion and self acceptance within growth. I think self awareness is just fundamentally important.
Yeah.
And I said earlier I was going to stick a pin in the role of predictive processing in New Year's
Oh yeah.
resolutions, and I do think it's maybe not kind of practically actionable in the way that the distributed cognition stuff is, but having a kind of awareness of the cognitive dynamics that are in play and understanding, okay, reflecting on your expectations and how you feel when you're presented with certain evidence from the world, like, oh, I've just kind of seen this or heard this and it's made me feel this certain way. Learning about your own affective profile. Okay,
Hmm.
what makes me anxious? What makes me happy or joyful? And I think that's it's not new to say that. I mean, philosophers for a long time have been saying that kind of like the examined life is what's most important. So I think, yeah, self awareness, examination of your own cognitive kind of proclivities and habits, and then you can decide kind of what do you want to change.
Yeah.
But I think
Yeah.
but I think there's this fundamental tension between self acceptance and self improvement, which is something that I think about a lot. I mean,
That's a good one.
you know,
Mhm.
to be healthy, to be well under predictive processing is to essentially have expectations that are adaptive to managing uncertainty in a
Mhm.
kind of effective way. And so, if there are sources of uncertainty in your life, if you're skinny and you don't like the way you look, you could go to the gym and train really hard and eat more calories and try and change that. You can kind of actively infer a different you, or you could just try and kind of update your priors through various kinds of mindfulness practices and think, oh,
Mhm.
I shouldn't be so hard on myself because this is a source of great stress. And actually, the stress here is not coming from me being skinny, it's coming from my longing to not be skinny.
Yeah.
So I think this is just a constant balance. And what's most important there is having the self awareness and the wisdom to know when to press the gas and to know when to back off. And I think like that's one of the key components of happiness is knowing when to push yourself. If you're getting bad grades in school and if I was gonna fail my PhD because I wasn't getting the work done, and when I was supposed to be writing, I was playing video games. Like, I would argue that's not a time for self acceptance. Right? That's like,
Sure.
you should change. Sometimes you should change some things.
Yeah.
And for some people, that's going to be more often, and for other people, that's going to be less often. But other times it's maybe more wise to just accept your flaws the way they are and recognize that the kind of the sense you have that the stakes are really high is just in your own head.
Yeah. That's beautiful, to be honest. I really loved your whole answer there. And I think like listening back to that will be so beautiful because I think you're making such a nice point of kind of, if I can say, like a way of life. Like it's a constant balance between between the growth and the self-acceptance, or self-improvement and self-acceptance, right? That yes, sometimes we have to accept ourselves, the way we are, and move on, carry on.
Mm.
And then sometimes, of course, like you have to self improve, because like because yeah, then you go back to your comfort zone, and then it's like, okay, you have no growth. And I think it's important in life to have growth.
Mm.
That's a beautiful answer. Is there anywhere that you post your thoughts, like anywhere that people can kind of start following you?
Well, people can follow me on Twitter. Yeah, so my handle on Twitter is at midnight biscuit,
Okay.
midnight underscore biscuit, I think.
Hmm.
And but I don't really. I'm not a kind of active Twitter user. It's not. I'm not posting opinions or thoughts on there. It's literally just my work.
Yeah, yeah.
And same with my Google Scholar. All of my publications are on there. If people search for Ben White Sussex on
Hmm.
Google Scholar, they'll find me. And aside from that, I tend to be quite offline.
Reserved, yeah, or offline, yeah. I don't know. I was thinking of that before, but like I believe that you could be a positive role model within the academia. Like, because on the first conversation we had, you were thinking of, like, you were saying how with some of your friends were thinking of starting a podcast or
Yeah,
like doing
yeah,
something.
yeah. We were. Well, we still are.
Exactly.
Uh, it takes. It's quite daunting. When we actually start thinking about it seriously.
Yeah.
We're thinking about what kinds of topics would we want to approach, and I do care about finding an alternative to the role models. I have a friend who in the UK is a high school teacher,
Hmm.
and she talks to me quite often about the influences and the attitudes that young boys, 14, 15-year-old boys have, and I find it really quite upsetting and frightening. And I know, part of the reason I find it so frightening is because I myself, when I go on social media, I go on YouTube, for example, and sometimes
Hmm.
you should see what YouTube recommends to me, especially when it comes to the shorts. Like
Yeah.
all of that content is just like Andrew Tate this, Andrew Tate
Yeah.
that,
I
um,
get it.
and it makes me quite angry. I think like it's a real sad kind of situation that there's no answer to that. There's no positive role model. I wouldn't presume that I can fill that role, but I'm sure some people probably could.
Yeah.
It's an interesting conversation to have. Like, what does that role model look like?
Hmm.
But like I say, I think there's a disadvantage in the kinds of platforms that we have because they're so short form and so restrictive. Like this, the case for good is a harder case to make. Not necessarily a harder case to make, but it's a case that requires a different kind of platform, a different kind of delivery system. I mean, there are lots of podcasts that kind of bringing back long form content. In a
Hmm.
way, it's not that there's no long form kind of platforms out there. But yeah, I don't know if we're going to start that
Yeah.
podcast. maybe
No, fair. Yeah.
maybe at some point, but yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I do agree with you. I think podcast would be a good thing. And as you say, like long form content now exists. I think you still need to find the right podcast, because again, like you have now podcasts that lean towards, one way. It's so difficult to find like positive role models, because then you can go into like, okay, what's a positive role model for me? Because
Yeah,
everyone has their own
there's this
reality.
whole conversation there about what constitutes a positive role model for young men.
Yeah.
What are the attributes there that are really key?
Mm,
What kinds of attributes should we be trying to change versus kind of cultivating? And it's all very fraught. But I think it's very hard to say what a good masculine role model looks like,
true.
but it's very easy to say what a bad one looks like.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
Very, yeah.
I think it's clear that a lot of the role models out there are very bad.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I do agree with you. Yeah. Ben, thank you so much. Honestly, it has been an absolute pleasure
It's
of
been really
conversation.
good fun.
Thank you.
Yes.